welcome back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we are going to conclude our discussion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1. And in order to do that, we should recall to ourselves a few of the points that we made last time when talking about Book 1, Chapter 7. So you remember in Chapter 7, we saw Aristotle's famous function argument. And there are really two major conclusions that come out of that argument. So first, Aristotle tells us that just like everything has a function, so a human being has a function. And the function of a human being, he says, is activity in accordance with reason. So that's the first major claim, is that for us to fulfill our human purpose, we have to act in a way that is dictated or allowed by reason. So using our reason to think through about how to live a proper human life, that is the purpose of a human life. And secondly, if we do that, if we use our reason to think about how we ought to properly act, then what that means is we will have attained virtue. And if we fail to do that, we'll have attained, as we're going to see, vice. So he says our purpose is to engage in activity in accordance with reason. If we do that, we will be a morally virtuous individual. If we fail to do that, we'll be morally vicious. Now, the specific connection between the use of reason and moral virtue, we're going to have to wait to see that connection until we look at Book 2. But for the moment, let's note that this, Aristotle thinks, is the primary purpose of a human life. Now, one thing you might notice about this is that the ability to use your reason to act in a virtuous way is something that, at least in Aristotle's view, would be more or less largely under your control. In life, many horrible things can happen to you, many tragedies, natural disasters and diseases and deaths of family members, oppression, right? Many horrible things can happen to an individual. And for the most part, those things, we will say, are not under that person's control. It just is a sad fact of life that many bad things can happen to people for which they could not have avoided and for which they are not responsible in any way. And so although the person isn't responsible for those tragedies that happen in their life, one thing to note here is that we might say that person still can be responsible for acting in a morally virtuous way. At least this is what Aristotle would think. No matter what your circumstances in life are, you can, as a human being, you can still use your reason to consider what would be the proper way for a human being to act. What are the sorts of habits I should be developing? What sort of character should I be developing in the face of these tragic circumstances? So one interesting point of Aristotle's view about our human purpose, using reason to attain virtue, is that it's essentially within our control. And you'll recall this is one of the reasons that Aristotle said a life of honor or politics simply couldn't be what constitutes human happiness or our human purpose, because that sort of life is not under our control. But of course, this should bring up another question. Let's suppose that Aristotle's correct, that our human purpose is something that is in our control. Is that all we need for happiness? Are there other sorts of goods that we need to achieve eudaimonia? And in fact, Aristotle thinks there are. And in this lesson, what we're going to be looking at is what is the relationship between the attainment of virtue and other sorts of goods. So in Chapter 8, Aristotle distinguishes between three types of goods. He calls some external goods, there are goods of the soul, and there are goods of the body. So one commentator, T.D. Roche, gives a little more explanation about what each of these is. So when we're talking about external goods, we're talking about goods that lie outside of a person's mind or their feelings or character. Things like friends, wealth, political power, a noble birth, good children, honor, etc. So these are sort of achievements or accomplishments that we might want, but are not directly sort of reliant on our state of mind and our character. Then there are also goods of the soul, and these are largely having to do with goods of, you might also call them goods of the mind. So on the one hand, we would consider goods of the soul to be our character traits, right? So these might be traits of our intellect, being very intelligent or quick-witted. They might be moral virtues, which is what Aristotle is largely going to be concerned with in Book 2. Things like courage or temperance or loyalty or benevolence. These would all be good states of character. Honesty, for instance. Or a good of the soul might also be certain feelings it has in a more passive way, like pleasure would be a good of the soul, and pain would be a bad or a harm to the soul. So there are external goods, goods of the soul, and then there are goods of the body, right? So these are just desirable sort of physical qualities we might have, so health and strength, or for instance, good looks. So there are these three sorts of goods. And so one of Aristotle's questions is, which of these goods is most important, and do we need all these goods to live a good human life? And I want to start by considering, as Aristotle does, goods of the soul, because as we're going to see, as I've already explained, goods of the soul include virtue, and so we should expect Aristotle to say, and in fact he does, that goods of the soul are most important. Right, so we see him saying here, goods of the soul are the ones we call most strictly and especially good. Okay, so let's see why that is. Remember, in terms of goods of the soul, we're talking mainly about two things. Character traits, right? Whether moral or intellectual virtues, courage, honesty, temperance, loyalty, things like that. Or we're talking about pleasure. So he's going to have a few comments to say about each of these. So first, he wants to make an important point about moral character traits. Things like honesty and courage and justice. So, the first thing to think about is that think about what it would mean to say that someone has the trait of being courageous. You might say, well, it means that this person is prepared to act in a certain way toward danger. Right? So if you're a courageous person, it means you have the ability or you have the willingness when you see danger and it needs to be faced, you're the sort of person who would be willing to face that danger. Okay. Now, that seems right, but one of the things that Aristotle wants to mention here is that when we truly talk about the goods of the soul in terms of character traits, when we talk about someone who's truly courageous, truly honest, it's not enough just to possess a certain sort of disposition or willingness. It's not just enough to just be prepared to act in a courageous way. You have to actually undergo that action. So Aristotle tells us the end consists in certain actions and activities. Because the happy person, as we've said before, lives well and acts well, and happiness is pretty much a kind of living well and acting well. So from the very beginning, and we've seen this already, our human purpose is acting in accordance with reason. And so when we talk about virtue, when we talk about having a virtuous character, it's not just being prepared or hypothetically I would act courageously or honestly. It's that you actually do it in the real world. And as he continues on, it says, it makes a great difference whether we conceive of the chief good as consisting in possession or in use, a state or an activity. So does the courageous person just have a certain willingness in their mind? And does the person just have an ability to act courageously? Or do they, as a matter of fact, act courageously? And he gives the following example. He says, as in the Olympic Games, it's not the most attractive and strongest who are crowned, but those who compete, since it is from this group that winners come. So in life, it is those who act rightly who will attain what is noble and good. So you can imagine someone who has the ability to act in the most honest or courageous manner. But when push comes to shove, whether out of maybe just sloth or laziness or just not paying attention to the situation, whatever the reason is, when the time comes to act honestly or act courageously, although they would have the ability to do so, they don't actually follow through. And if that's the case, we're not going to call that person honest, we're not going to call that person courageous, just because they have the ability to act in the right way. In the same way, he's saying the strongest weightlifter, someone every 4 years you have the Summer Olympics where all the best weightlifters in the world compete. And the person who gets the gold medal is the person who, of the group who is competing, who actually lifted the most. Now, it's possible there could have been someone just sitting at home on the couch watching the Olympics who could have lifted more. But they didn't compete. They weren't there, so they don't get crowned. In life, it is the same way. It's not just those who can act nobly and can act well. It is those who actually do those things. Okay, and we're going to have much more to say about what it means of a virtuous character when we look at Book 2. But first, when he talks about virtue as a good of the soul, he's talking about not just our willingness to act well, but the fact that we actually do it in real life. Okay, now, you'll also recall that one good of the soul was virtue, which he thinks is ultimately, as we're going to see, the highest good for a human being. It fulfills our purpose. But he also said pleasure is a good of the soul. And it could be surprising, you might say, that Aristotle thinks pleasure is a good of the soul, because earlier we saw that Aristotle says a life of pleasure can't constitute our human purpose. And that is correct. Aristotle doesn't think that the happy life is merely the pleasurable life. And he sort of reiterates this point again when he says he's going to say that pleasure does have a role, but it's not the pleasure of the masses. So what is the pleasure of the masses? The pleasure of the masses, because they are not pleasant by nature, conflict with one another. But the pleasures of those who are fond of noble things are pleasant by nature. So what does this mean? So he says take the average person, right, who is sort of not going through this critical exercise of thinking how to live a proper human life, and think about how that person lives their life. Well, they might seek pleasure in a variety of sources. So, for instance, they might seek pleasure in food and drink and sloth and just sort of relaxing. They might seek pleasure in that way. But on the other hand, they might also want pleasure from honor, from reputation. And they might want both of these things, but notice how both of those sorts of pleasures conflict with one another. If you want pleasure from honor, you have to get up off the couch and achieve things, or if not achieve things, at least convince people you've achieved things. But of course, if you're spending your time doing that, then you're foregoing the more straightforward, immediate, sensual pleasures of eating, drinking, and let's say lying around the couch and watching TV. So you can think of all sorts of ways in which this is the case. If we just think about pleasure for its own sake, there's so many ways you can gain pleasure, and many of those are going to conflict with one another. So Aristotle is going to say, the sort of pleasure I have in mind is not that kind of pleasure. It's actually a pleasure that's related to virtue. Now, Aristotle's point is not that we should never enjoy simpler pleasures. It's not even that we should never enjoy honor or something like that. But that's not the primary thing that makes us live a happy life. We do need pleasures of diversion, but the sort of pleasure we should be focusing on is something else. And so this is the sort of thing he has in mind. He says, their life therefore has no need of pleasure as some kind of lucky ornament, but contains its pleasure in itself. Because in addition to what we have already said, the person who does not enjoy noble actions is not good. So what's the sort of pleasure that we should be concerned with? It's not the pleasure of a sort of lucky ornament to your life, right? So you say, okay, I really want the pleasure that comes from having a good reputation, from the praise of other people. So again, you work really hard to achieve certain things, and then you just sort of wait around and see, are people going to like what I did or not? Are they going to like the movie I made? Are they going to appreciate my athletic performance? Is the professor going to like what I did on the exam, right? You sit around and wait and see how other people evaluate you. And if they evaluate you well, then hey, you got lucky, and there's an ornament on your life. That's a sort of an additional pleasure that was put on top of your life. But again, that's not so much in your control, and it's a sort of path where you're always going to be seeking to please other people, or if you are looking for just the more immediate sensual pleasures of food and drink and sex, you're going to be led down a path of always trying to fill those appetites, which always need you to eat more food and drink more, etc., etc. So that's pleasure as sort of a lucky ornament. But he says the true pleasure we should be focused on is taking pleasure in our virtuous actions. So our overall purpose is using our reason in order to attain a virtuous character. And if that's our overall purpose, then the best sort of pleasure, the most long-lasting, sustainable pleasure, is the pleasure you get from knowing you've developed a good character, the pleasure you get from knowing that you've done noble actions. And this isn't a pleasure that's added onto your life. It's a kind of pleasure you take in your life itself. Aristotle previously told us that happiness is a self-sufficient state, and this makes sense. If happiness truly is self-sufficient, if nothing else needs to be added to it, well, then it wouldn't make sense to say, yeah, I use my reason to act virtuously, but now I really need to add some pleasure into the mix. If that sort of life really is self-sufficient, then we should be able to take pleasure in doing the right thing. As we're going to see in Book 2, this is actually a fundamental component of what Aristotle thinks it means to have a good character. Okay, so that's what Aristotle thinks are the most important goods: virtue and then pleasure and virtue. And those are goods of the soul. But now I want to return to the other two types of goods. Because, as we're going to see, although Aristotle clearly thinks that virtue and the goods of the soul are the most important, he does think that a fully happy, fully flourishing human life, that a life that we would characterize as having achieved eudaimonia, requires the other kinds of goods as well. And you'll notice I'm sort of grouping these together, so just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to what Aristotle calls external goods and the goods of the body, both as external goods. So the main split really is the goods of virtue and everything else, all the external goods. So notice what he says about external goods. Happiness obviously needs the presence of external goods as well, since it's impossible, or at least no easy matter, to perform noble actions without resources. Okay, so the first reason he says that you actually need goods such as wealth and power and honor and children, etc., and health and all these things, is that you can't actually act virtuously if you don't have some external goods. So just take health, for instance. So you might be someone, again, who has the state of courage. You're willing to be you're willing to be courageous. If the opportunity came up, you would face the danger that needs to be faced. But let's say your body is unhealthy. You're suffering from a certain sort of illness which prevents you from actually taking action. Well, then we can't say that you are courageous in that instance, and it's not your fault, right? You're suffering from this illness. But there is a sense in which something outside of your control was necessary as a resource for you to act virtuously. And you could see how this could be the case with friends and wealth and political power. If you want to do good in the world, you do, in fact, need resources. If you want to be a generous person, for instance, you need the wealth to be generous. And so the first thing he says is that we cannot actually act, and because ultimately being a good person is about action, we can't act well if we don't have the resources to do it. And secondly, he also points out that there are some conditions we can be born into that no matter how virtuously we act in response to those conditions, we simply can't look at someone in those conditions and say, well, they're flourishing or truly happy in a human sense. He says, for the person who is terribly ugly, of low birth, or solitary and childless, is not really the sort to be happy. Still less, perhaps, if he has children or friends who are thoroughly bad or good but dead. As we have said, then, there seems to be an additional need for some sort of prosperity like this. So certain sorts of very severe misfortunes that can happen to us can undermine our happiness even if we are acting correctly and acting virtuously. So the first point he makes is that we do need external goods in order to live a happy, flourishing human life. But the real question then is, how are these related, and how important are the external goods? Now, the first thing to say is what I have been sort of hinting at, and now we're moving into chapters 9 and 11 of Book 1. The first thing to say is that the way in which these are related is that the good of virtue is always going to be the primary component of happiness or eudaimonia, right? The primary component of eudaimonia will be happiness. as he says, our account of happiness said that it was a certain kind of activity in the soul in accordance with virtue. So virtue is primary. All the other goods, these are necessary conditions of happiness and naturally helpful and serve as means to it, but they're secondary. So virtue is primary, the external goods are secondary. Okay. Now, what's interesting here is to think about, well, why is that the case? Why fundamentally is it the case that we should see virtue as the most important and primary component of eudaimonia, and the external goods as the secondary component? Well, in part, we've already seen the answer. In part, it is because, according to the function argument, our human purpose is to use our reason to act and develop virtue. That's our human purpose. So that's one of the main reasons why. But he gives some further explanation as to why this is the case. So he tells us it would also be something widely shared, since everyone who is not incapacitated with regard to virtue could attain it through some kind of learning and personal effort. So first he says, one thing to notice about virtue is, unless you're sort of just extremely incapacitated, right? Unless you, the normal functionings of a human being, especially mental functioning of a human being, is not available to you in a very severe way, everyone has the ability to attain virtue. We're not, as we're going to see, we're not naturally virtuous, we're not born virtuous, but he says all human beings are born with the ability to develop virtue. And that's an important thing, because it's a part of happiness that's available to every single person if they put in the time, the skill, and the conscious effort. And he says, and if it is better to be happy in this way than by chance, it is reasonable that happiness should be attained like this. To entrust what is greatest and most noble to chance would be quite inappropriate. So we might wonder, why is that the case? He's saying that everyone can develop virtue, and this is a reason why we should see virtue as the primary component of happiness, because otherwise happiness would largely be dependent on chance. But what's wrong with that? Well, I think one way to think about why he says that would be inappropriate is because think of how much of a tragedy that would be. It's already a tragedy enough that many external goods are out of our control, and to a large extent there's nothing we can do about that. But think of how much of a tragedy it would be if even the primary component of happiness were not under our control. On Aristotle's picture, yes, you can't control fundamentally your wealth or political power or your reputation or your health or your strength, but you can control your virtue. And so that gives you at least the largest portion of happiness, even if your circumstances of life may prevent you from achieving full happiness. But if even the primary component of happiness was blocked off to you because of your misfortune in life, because of bad luck, that would truly be a tragedy. And so Aristotle thinks, no, this cannot be the case. The primary component of happiness must be virtue, something under our control. Now, you might disagree with Aristotle here. You might just simply say that he isn't owning up to the fact that life is tragic. And maybe that's right, but Aristotle at least thinks that happiness should be available, at least the major portion of it, to all people. Okay. Now, so in terms of the external goods, however, again, he says there are many vicissitudes in life, many things we can't control, and you're not going to call someone happy who meets with these misfortunes and comes to a wretched end. Right? So no matter how virtuous you are, if your life throws you such horrible circumstances that you come to a very poor, wretched end and are unsuccessful in all your endeavors, we can't really say you're truly happy. And what's interesting about this is that Aristotle thinks this fact even applies to what happens after you die. Because remember, if external goods are things that are beyond your control, and if they contain things like reputation and friends and children, then there will be events after your death that also matter to your happiness. So notice how he explains this. He says, for both good and evil are thought to happen to a dead person, since they can happen to a person who is alive but not aware of them. Okay, so what is he saying here? was saying, look, it is actually possible for the happiness of a person to be affected after they're dead, because our happiness can be affected by things that we don't even know are happening. So take one simple example. Suppose that it was the case that many of your friends, or people who you thought were your friends, were gossiping about you and talking badly behind your back. Suppose also, right, they're spreading all these rumors, and suppose also not only that you don't know about it at the time, but that you're never going to find out about that. They keep this gossip well concealed, and we'll just suppose it never actually gets back to you. So think about how, for a second, that sort of situation. So you're imagining that situation. Now we're able to take a step back and look at it from an outsider's perspective. Now, from the perspective of the person being gossiped about, it's not going to affect their experience. They won't know one way or another. But from an outsider perspective, we can look at them and say, I feel a sense of pity for you. I feel sorry for you. Something as bad is happening to you and you don't even know about it. It may not be affecting your pleasure and pain. It may not be affecting your experience, but it still seems like a bad thing that your friends are betraying you. Now, if you accept that something like that is possible, then why wouldn't we say the same thing about someone who has died? So suppose there's someone who has died, and after they've died, facts about them have come out which have ruined their reputation. This person was previously, very well regarded, but then certain facts come out about how this person treated her friends or her spouse or her coworkers, and we say, wow, we thought this was a great person, and it turns out this person was actually not a very virtuous, not a good person at all. They were mean, they were nasty. So if it can be the case that our well-being could be affected by the fact that people are gossiping about us behind our back, and we don't know about it, then why would the fact that someone has died prevent their well-being being affected as well? It's true that the dead person isn't going to know that their reputation has been affected or influenced, but it still is being affected or influenced. And if the reputation they had was one of their external goods, and if that reputation was ruined after their death, then they've lost one of the good things in their life. And to some extent, their happiness has been undermined. Or take another example. Many people have children with the hopes that they will set them up for a life in which their children will be prosperous after they're dead. Right? So you don't just want your children to do well while you're alive. You say, I want their entire lives to be filled with as much happiness and flourishing and prosperity as possible. But suppose after the parent dies that the child's life takes a downturn. Many horrible tragedies befall the child. Many extreme misfortunes. Now, the parent being dead doesn't know about any of that. The parent being dead isn't in control of any of that, but still, it's one of their major wishes and desires that went unfulfilled. You can imagine someone who sets up an important foundation doing charitable work during their life, and after their death, it just completely crumbles and the whole project goes to waste. Again, not under their control, but another way in which a significant project in your life that was giving you meaning and purpose to what you were doing, it just failed. And if that's the case, then again, it seems like you've lost something even though you have died. And so part of the reason why Aristotle thinks this is based on an earlier statement he makes in Book 7, where he says that happiness must be judged over a complete life. And apparently even beyond that, because your life isn't going to just be circumscribed by the day you're born and the day you die, but it's going to be circumscribed by all the time it takes for your projects and your goals and your desires and aims to either be realized or to fail. And this tells us something important about the way we see a human life. A human life is all those projects that we are undergoing, that we want to see succeed. And to a certain extent, just as Our ability to experience the success of those projects is outside of our control. The ultimate success of those projects is outside of our control, because it might turn out that the success or failure happens after we're dead. And so therefore, to judge whether we are truly happy, whether we were truly successful, truly flourishing, we have to see what happens to those projects all the way to their final endpoint. And so for all these reasons, Aristotle explains, in fact, we can only judge our happiness after we've died. We might have to see what happens to our children. We might, as he mentions in this passage here, I won't read through it, but as he mentions here, it might also be the case that we have to take into account what happens to our friends after we die. And so the main point to get here is that for Aristotle, yes, of course, virtue is the primary component of our happiness, but our happiness can be influenced by external goods. And in chapter 10, he gives, I think, a really nice summary of how these are finally related. So he says, what is to prevent us then from concluding that the happy person is the one who, adequately furnished with external goods, engages in activities in accordance with complete virtue, not for just any period of time, but over a complete life? So the happy person, judged from the entire span of their life and all the projects they engaged in, right, consistently achieved a state of complete virtue. They used their reason to see how to properly act. And he says they were adequately furnished with external goods. And I think that's important, because I think for Aristotle, while external goods matter, at the end of the day, external goods will not matter if you're not virtuous. Right? You can't simply say, well, okay, because external goods matter to some extent, I can just lack virtue but get a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of wealth, have my children do very well. That wouldn't be right. He says we should be adequately furnished with external goods. We need enough external goods and we're not suffering misfortune. We need the resources to put our projects into action and be successful. We need the resources to act virtuously. But no external good truly matters if you have a thoroughly vicious moral character. And for that reason, at the end of the day, virtue is still going to be the primary component of human happiness, the primary component of human flourishing. Okay, so I will stop there. I hope this video was useful. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.